For most of his life, Rob Reiner had been known as a man who believed deeply in stories. Stories where broken friendships healed, where loyalty mattered, where love found a way through fear. His films taught audiences that pain could be transformed into meaning if people were willing to face it honestly. From the outside, his own family seemed to embody that same warmth. A famous name, a creative household, laughter echoing through a Brentwood home that felt protected from the chaos of the world. But behind that image, something fragile had been forming for years, quietly and relentlessly, waiting for the moment when silence could no longer contain it. Jake Reiner believed that Christmas might still save what had been drifting apart. He pictured the table set just right, familiar music in the background, the glow of lights soft enough to blur old disappointments. In his mind, it was not a fantasy, but a final chance. A moment where time would slow down long enough for his family to remember who they once were together. Jake had always been the one who held things in, the one who stayed composed when tension rose, the one who believed that patience was a form of love. He carried that belief into adulthood, convinced that endurance could eventually lead to peace. Then December 14th arrived, and everything collapsed without warning. The phone call came suddenly, stripping the air from his lungs. His parents were gone. The words felt unreal, as if they belonged to someone else's life. But the shock deepened into something far worse when he heard the name connected to it. Nick Reiner, his younger brother. The same brother he had protected since childhood. The same brother the family had always wrapped in care, concern, and endless forgiveness. In that instant, grief turned into disbelief, and disbelief hardened into a pain that would not loosen its grip. When Jake later appeared on air, the studio lights revealed a man barely holding himself together. His face looked sharper, worn down by sleepless nights and thoughts he could not silence. This was not performance or preparation. This was exposure. When he spoke, his voice trembled, not because he lacked control, but because control had finally failed him. He said something that stunned everyone listening. He said he had warned them. Months earlier, he had told his parents he was afraid. Not angry, afraid. He sensed that something was slipping beyond repair, that Nick's instability had reached a point where love alone might not be enough. Those words changed how the tragedy was understood. This was not a sudden break from normalcy. It was the result of years of tension, denial, and emotional imbalance that had quietly shaped the family from the inside. Growing up as the oldest child meant Jake learned early how to step aside. Attention flowed elsewhere. His role became clear before he ever chose it. Be strong. Be calm. Do not add weight to an already fragile situation. Nick was smaller, quieter, more volatile, and fear shaped how everyone responded to him. Mistakes were softened. Outbursts were explained away. Love became inseparable from anxiety. Jake adapted by disappearing emotionally. He gave up space, swallowed words, and learned that silence could keep the peace, even if it cost him something invisible but permanent. Over time, that silence became a habit, then a shield. His parents believed they were protecting their family. Rob believed, perhaps more than anyone, in the power of patience. He had spent his life telling stories where persistence led to healing. He wanted to believe the same rules apply to home. But real life does not follow a script. When Nick later called from custody, crying and begging for help, asking for money, asking for rescue, Jake said no. Not out of cruelty, but out of recognition. Something had already been lost that could not be restored by another act of protection. As Los Angeles moved through those heavy winter days, the city felt muted, as if holding its breath. Cameras flashed, voices filled the air, but beneath it all was a quiet truth that refused to be ignored. This tragedy was not just about what happened. It was about what had been seen, what had been felt, and what had gone unanswered for far too long. And this was only the beginning of what Jake would finally allow himself to say. Long before tragedy forced his life into the public eye, Jake Reiner learned how heavy a last name could feel when it followed you everywhere. Being born into the Reiner household meant growing up surrounded by creativity, conversation, and a sense that stories mattered. Cameras, scripts, and laughter were part of daily life, and from the outside it looked effortless. But for Jake, that world came with an unspoken expectation. When your father is Rob Reiner, people assume confidence comes naturally, that doors open easily, that belonging is guaranteed. What they never see is the pressure to disappear inside that shadow, to become smaller so the name can stay large. Jake was the oldest, which meant responsibility arrived early and quietly. He learned to observe before he learned to speak. When conversations shifted, when tension crept into a room, he was the one who adjusted first. Not because anyone told him to, but because someone always had to keep things steady. His younger siblings were watched more closely, especially Nick, whose moods could shift without warning. Jake sensed early that the emotional center of the family revolved around fragility. Love was real, but it was cautious, careful, shaped by fear of what might happen if control slipped. As a child, Jake gave things up without announcing it. Toys, attention, moments of validation. When he felt overlooked, he learned to translate disappointment into patience. Silence became his language. It was easier to swallow words than to risk making things worse. Over time, that silence hardened into identity. He was the dependable one, the calm presence, the son who did not cause trouble. Praise came quietly, if at all, because stability was expected, not celebrated. Nick, on the other hand, absorbed the family's anxiety. His struggles were met with explanations and protection. Every outburst came with reassurance. Every mistake came with hope that this time would be different. Jake understood the love behind it, but he also felt the imbalance grow. He watched how fear disguised itself as care, how boundaries softened until they barely existed. He never resented his brother for it, but he felt the cost accumulating inside himself, year after year. Rob tried to hold everything together the only way he knew how. He believed in endurance, in showing up, in trusting that patience could outlast chaos. Baseball became one of the few spaces where father and son could exist without tension. Sitting side by side at Dodger Stadium, surrounded by noise that didn't belong to them, they shared something simple and sacred. For a few hours, the weight lifted. No crises, no explanations. Just innings passing in silence that felt safe rather than suffocating. Those moments mattered more than either of them admitted. They became anchors, proof that connection was still possible without words. Jake clung to them quietly, storing them away as reminders of who his father was beneath the stress. But even in those moments, the larger reality never disappeared. Nick's presence loomed in the background, shaping decisions, conversations, and emotional energy. Family life slowly transformed into something reactive, always bracing for the next disruption. As Jake grew older, the pressure of the Reiner name pushed him in the opposite direction of what people expected. Hollywood did not feel like freedom. It felt like exposure. Living publicly while hiding private chaos seemed unbearable. He began to ask himself whether following that path would erase what little space he had carved out for himself. Fame did not promise clarity. It threatened to magnify confusion. So he chose journalism. It was structured, grounded, rooted in truth rather than image. Studying broadcast journalism gave him language for observation, for distance, for telling stories without becoming them. In newsrooms, he found something he had been missing: boundaries, purpose. A place where calm under pressure was valued, not taken for granted. Starting at smaller stations, then working his way up, he built credibility slowly. No shortcuts, no favors. His voice became steady because it had learned to survive long before it learned to report. Colleagues noticed his composure during difficult stories. Viewers trusted him because he never chased drama. He understood pain, but he did not exploit it. What they did not see was how familiar it all felt. Long nights, emotional restraint, carrying weight quietly. Journalism did not change who Jake was. It revealed who he had always been. Even as his career stabilized, the family strain never fully loosened its grip. Nick's struggles escalated through cycles of recovery and relapse. Hope returned, then faded, then returned again. Rob and Michelle aged under the constant stress, their lives narrowing around vigilance. Jake watched from a distance, torn between duty and exhaustion. He wanted to intervene, to fix what was breaking, but years of silence had taught him how little control he truly had. Eventually, acting found its way back into his life, not as inheritance, but as exploration. He approached it cautiously, with the same discipline he applied to journalism. Roles came slowly. He avoided spectacle. What drew people to his performances was restraint, an ability to convey depth without noise. It was the same quality that had shaped his entire life. Through it all, one truth remained constant. Jake had learned how to survive by holding everything inside. By the time warning turned into tragedy, that survival instinct would be tested beyond its limits. And the silence he had mastered for decades would finally break, not because he wanted it to, but because it could no longer carry the weight alone. By the time everything finally unraveled, the warning signs had already been living quietly in the background for years, blending so seamlessly into daily life that they no longer felt like alarms. For Jake Reiner, the tension surrounding his younger brother had become a constant hum, something he carried without naming. Nick moved through cycles that always looked the same from the outside, but felt increasingly dangerous from within. Short stretches of stability followed by long descents into chaos. Promises spoken with conviction, then broken without explanation. Each return was greeted with cautious hope, each relapse absorbed with quiet resignation. As Nick entered his mid-teens, the changes became impossible to ignore. His eyes looked tired even when he was young. His moods swung without warning, leaving rooms tense and conversations unfinished. Nights stretched longer. Disappearances became harder to explain. Jake watched closely, not with judgment, but with a growing sense of dread. He sensed that Nick was trying to communicate something he could not say out loud, that beneath the anger and instability there was fear looking for an exit. But fear, when left unaddressed, has a way of turning inward before it explodes outward. Their parents responded the only way they knew how. With patience, with reassurance, with belief that love could still outpace whatever darkness was forming. Rob Reiner refused to give up on the idea that persistence mattered more than caution. He had spent his life believing that people could be guided back from the edge if they were given enough understanding. Michelle followed the same instinct, anchoring herself to hope because the alternative felt unbearable. As long as Nick was breathing, she believed there was still time. Jake stood between those convictions and the reality he was observing. He did not argue. He did not accuse. He absorbed. He watched his parents age faster than they should have, shoulders tightening under a weight they never acknowledged. He watched his mother flinch at the sound of a late-night phone call, watched his father fall silent when conversations turned toward the future. The family was no longer living forward. They were surviving moment to moment, measuring peace in hours rather than years. When Nick moved between schools and recovery programs, each return came with renewed determination. This time will be different. This time he meant it. Jake wanted to believe that more than anyone, because believing was easier than confronting what fear had already taught him. But with every cycle, the margin for error narrowed. The household adapted to instability as if it were weather, unpredictable but accepted. And that acceptance quietly eroded boundaries that once protected everyone. 3 months before everything ended, Nick wanted to move back into the Brentwood home. The request landed like a blow to Jake's chest. Something about it felt wrong immediately. It wasn't just concern. It was instinct sharpened by years of observation. Panic rose before logic could catch up. Jake called his parents, his voice tight, words chosen carefully. He told them he was afraid, not frustrated, afraid. He said Nick was not well, that the situation felt unsafe, that love alone might not be enough this time. He did not raise his voice. He did not threaten. He pleaded. On the other end of the phone, Rob listened calmly. He reminded Jake that Nick was family, that people deserved another chance, that turning him away might cause more harm than help. Michelle echoed that reassurance, promising they would be careful, that they would watch closely, that they would not let things get out of hand. Jake heard the love in their voices, but he also heard something else, resolve rooted in hope rather than caution. When the call ended, the dread did not leave him. It settled deeper. The weeks that followed moved slowly and then all at once. Jake continued working, filming, traveling, trying to maintain distance from thoughts that would not quiet. Every unanswered message tightened the knot in his stomach. Every update felt incomplete. He replayed conversations in his head, questioning whether he should have pushed harder, said more, done something differently. But silence had always been his language, and breaking it felt unnatural even when fear demanded it. Then came December 14th. The call shattered everything. The words arrived without context, without mercy. His parents were gone. The house that held every childhood memory had become a crime scene. Jake's mind refused to process it, clinging to disbelief as a form of protection. But disbelief collapsed the moment he learned who had been arrested. Nick, the same brother he had warned them about. The same brother he had begged them to protect themselves from. In that instant, fear turned into something unbearable. Knowing he had seen the storm coming did not soften the impact. It sharpened it. Jake flew back to Los Angeles in a haze, moving through airports like a ghost. When he saw his sister, there were no words. They held each other and let grief speak in ways language could not. The city felt unfamiliar, stripped of warmth, every street echoing with absence. The noise of Hollywood meant nothing. All that remained was loss layered with questions that would never find clean answers. When Jake spoke publicly for the first time, the restraint he had perfected over decades finally cracked. Sitting under studio lights, his voice broke as he said the words he had held back for too long. He said he warned them. He said the warning came from fear, not anger. He said he never believed Nick was capable of something like this, but he knew something was wrong. The confession stunned viewers because it reframed the tragedy. This was not just violence. It was the end point of ignored signals and emotional exhaustion. After the broadcast, the phone rang again. Nick called from custody. His voice was desperate, panicked, stripped of bravado. He claimed innocence. He begged for help. He asked for money, for connections, for rescue. Jake listened, torn between memory and reality. He heard the frightened child he once protected and the man accused of taking everything from him. When Nick asked for bail, a number that felt unreal, something inside, Jake finally stopped bending. He said no. The word landed heavily, followed by silence that felt permanent. Nick exploded in anger, accusing Jake of betrayal, of abandonment. Jake cried as he responded, saying he could not save him this way, that this was something he could not fix. When the call ended, it felt like the last thread tying him to what remained of his family had snapped. The aftermath unfolded slowly, painfully. Public reaction was not outrage, but shock. Viewers watched a man break on live television, not performing grief, but drowning in it. Messages poured in, many saying they had never witnessed pain so raw in a place meant for information. The tragedy stopped being a headline and became a mirror, forcing people to confront uncomfortable truths about love, denial, and the limits of protection. For Jake, the worst part was not the attention. It was the knowledge that he had sensed the collapse before it happened, and could not stop it. That truth settled inside him, heavier than grief alone. Because this was not just loss. It was the realization that sometimes seeing clearly does not mean being able to change the outcome. And that realization would follow him long after the cameras shut off and the world moved on. After the shock settled into something dull and constant, the true weight of what had happened began to press down on everyone left behind. For Jake Reiner, grief did not arrive as a single overwhelming moment. It came in fragments, in quiet hours when the noise stopped, in familiar streets that no longer felt safe, in small details that refused to stay buried. The house in Brentwood, once filled with layered memories, became a place defined by absence. Every room seemed to echo with what could no longer be said, what could never be undone. The immediate aftermath blurred together. Legal procedures, statements, unanswered questions. Each step forward felt mechanical, stripped of emotion, because feeling everything at once would have been unbearable. Jake moved through it with the same composure that had carried him through years of restraint, but this time the calm felt hollow. The grief was not only for his parents, but for the version of family that no longer existed, the one he had protected in silence for so long. Public reaction arrived quickly, but it was not chaotic. It was quiet. Viewers who had watched him break on air struggled to find words that felt adequate. Many wrote that they had never seen pain displayed so honestly in a space meant for information, not emotion. The broadcast lingered in people's minds because it stripped away distance. This was not a celebrity tragedy told at arm's length. It was human suffering unfolding without a script. As the story spread, attention shifted toward Rob Reiner and the legacy he left behind. Tributes poured in, celebrating the warmth and humanity of his work, the films that shaped generations. But for Jake, those tributes cut both ways. Pride mixed with loss, admiration tangled with regret. The world remembered his father through stories of hope and connection, while Jake carried the private image of a man worn down by years of worry, trying desperately to hold his family together. Michelle's absence felt different, quieter, softer. Her presence had always been felt in the margins, in the way she watched rather than spoke, the way she loved without conditions. Losing her left a silence that felt impossible to fill. Jake found himself replaying moments he once overlooked, small gestures now magnified by loss. Grief sharpened memory, turning ordinary interactions into precious artifacts. The psychological toll deepened as days passed. Sleep became unreliable. When it came, it brought dreams filled with unfinished conversations and alternate endings. Jake questioned himself relentlessly. Had he done enough? Had he said enough? Could a different choice have altered the path they were on? Logic offered no comfort. Knowing that responsibility did not rest on him did little to ease the weight of survival guilt. Seeing what was coming without being able to stop, it created a wound that refused to close. His relationship with his brother became something impossible to define. Love, anger, sorrow, disbelief collided without resolving into anything stable. The idea that the same person could be both a victim of long-standing instability and the source of unimaginable loss fractured any simple narrative. Jake did not speak publicly about forgiveness or condemnation. He could not. The emotional ground was too unstable to stand on declarations. All he knew was that the bond they once shared no longer existed in any recognizable form. The media searched for explanations. Some framed the tragedy as a cautionary tale about family, others as a story of untreated illness, others as a devastating failure of boundaries. None of those angles felt complete. They simplified something that had unfolded slowly, quietly, shaped by fear and love in equal measure. Jake understood how tempting it was to assign blame, to draw clean lines where none existed. But real life had taught him that complexity is often what hurts the most. Professionally, the impact was immediate and strange. People recognized him differently now, not as a journalist delivering difficult stories, but as the subject of one. Every appearance carried a shadow. Every word was weighed, not just for meaning, but for tone. He became acutely aware of how fragile privacy is once grief becomes public property. Even sympathy felt invasive at times, arriving uninvited, demanding acknowledgement when he had nothing left to give. The long-term consequences began to surface quietly. Relationships shifted. Friends hesitated, unsure of what to say. Some disappeared, overwhelmed by the gravity of the loss. Others stayed close, offering silence instead of solutions. Jake learned who could sit with discomfort without trying to fix it. Those moments mattered more than grand gestures ever could. Inside, something fundamental changed. The instinct to hold everything together no longer served him. Carrying pain quietly had reached its limit. Yet speaking did not bring relief either. Words felt insufficient, thin against the weight of reality. He began to understand that healing would not arrive as closure, but as coexistence. Grief was not something to overcome. It was something to live alongside, reshaping identity in ways no one prepares for. The public conversation gradually moved on, as it always does. New stories replaced old ones. But for Jake, time did not restore balance. It only created distance between who he was and who he had been. The tragedy left marks that were not visible on the surface, but influenced every decision, every interaction. Trust felt more fragile. Hope felt cautious. What remained was an awareness that love, when driven by fear, can lose its way. That protection without boundaries can become its own kind of harm. These realizations did not arrive as lessons, but as quiet acknowledgments shaped by loss. They settled slowly, altering how Jake viewed family, responsibility, and the limits of endurance. And as the world continued forward, the question that lingered beneath everything was not how this happened, but how to live after seeing so clearly what could not be changed. In the weeks that followed, the loudest moments were not the ones filled with cameras or condolences, but the quiet spaces where memory crept in uninvited. For Jake Reiner, those moments arrived unexpectedly, triggered by objects that once felt insignificant. A jacket left hanging where it no longer belonged. A voicemail saved and replayed too many times. The echo of footsteps in a hallway that used to carry familiar rhythms. Grief did not announce itself. It slipped into the ordinary and reshaped it. There were stories about his parents that Jake had never spoken aloud before, moments that felt too private, too fragile to share even with those closest to him. Late nights when his father sat alone at the kitchen table long after everyone else had gone to bed, staring at nothing, hands wrapped around a cold cup of coffee. Mornings when his mother moved quietly through the house, careful not to wake anyone, as if silence itself could keep chaos from returning. These were not dramatic scenes. They were the small, human moments that revealed how deeply fear had woven itself into daily life. Jake remembered conversations that once felt insignificant, now replaying with unbearable clarity. His father admitting softly that he was tired, not physically, but emotionally. His mother confessing in a whisper that hope sometimes felt like the only thing keeping her standing. At the time, Jake absorbed those words without response, believing that being present was enough. Only later did he realize how much those confessions had been carrying and how little relief they had offered. Friends and colleagues began to share their own observations, fragments of a story that had always existed just outside public view. A close family friend recalled how Rob would deflect praise whenever Nick was mentioned, redirecting conversations to avoid drawing attention to strain. Another remembered Michelle calling late at night, voice tight, asking simple questions that carried deeper meaning. Is he safe? Did you hear from him? Do you think this will pass? These were not cries for help. They were attempts to survive uncertainty one day at a time. Jake himself had learned how to read the house by sound alone. The way doors closed, the rhythm of footsteps, the absence of laughter. He could sense when tension was rising long before voices followed. On those nights, he retreated into himself, believing distance was a form of protection. He told himself that staying quiet prevented escalation, that absorbing discomfort spared others from pain. It took years to understand that this strategy, while well-intentioned, allowed wounds to deepen unseen. There were moments when Jake almost spoke up, moments when words hovered just beneath the surface. A dinner cut short by silence. A holiday overshadowed by worry. Each time, he hesitated, choosing restraint over confrontation. He feared that naming the problem would make it real, that speaking would fracture what little balance remained. Silence felt safer, even as it slowly hollowed everything out. After the tragedy, these memories returned with sharp edges. Jake questioned not only what he had said, but what he had never allowed himself to say. He wondered whether honesty earlier might have shifted something, not dramatically, but enough to slow the descent. These thoughts did not arrive as accusations. They arrived as quiet doubts, lingering longer than he wanted them to. What surprised him most was how grief softened some memories rather than hardening them. He began recalling moments of warmth he had overlooked. His father's dry humor breaking through exhaustion. His mother's quiet gestures of reassurance. The way they both tried, imperfectly, to hold their family together with whatever tools they had. These recollections did not erase pain, but they complicated it, making blame feel insufficient and forgiveness feel unreachable. Jake also thought often about his brother as a child, long before instability took center stage. The small boy who followed him from room to room, asking endless questions, trusting without hesitation. Remembering that version of Nick made the present unbearable. It reminded Jake that no one in this story was untouched by loss, that damage had accumulated slowly, without a single moment where everything clearly broke. In private, Jake began writing things down, not for publication, but for survival. Fragments of thought, half-sentences, questions without answers. Writing became a way to place weight somewhere outside his body. He did not seek meaning. He sought release. Some nights, the words came easily. Other nights, the page remained blank, mirroring the emptiness he felt. People around him tried to offer perspective, reminding him that some outcomes cannot be controlled, that love does not always lead to safety. He understood these truths intellectually, but understanding did not soften their impact. The hardest part was accepting that intention and outcome can exist in complete opposition, that good faith decisions can still lead to irreversible harm. Slowly, Jake began to recognize a pattern that had shaped not just his family, but himself. The belief that endurance equals strength, that carrying pain quietly is noble, that holding things together matters more than asking for help. These ideas had guided him for decades, earning admiration and trust, but they also left him isolated when everything fell apart. As these realizations settled in, Jake felt something shift. Not healing, but awareness. A sense that continuing to live the same way would only repeat what had already been lost. The silence that once protected him now felt dangerous. He began to understand that speaking, even imperfectly, might be the only way forward. These reflections did not offer comfort. They offered clarity. And clarity, while painful, was something Jake had never truly allowed himself before. In confronting the quiet stories that lived beneath the tragedy, he was not searching for absolution. He was searching for a way to exist honestly in a world that no longer allowed hiding. As time stretched forward, the tragedy began to settle into something heavier than shock and quieter than despair. For Jake Reiner, grief slowly transformed into reflection, not because the pain had softened, but because living demanded movement even when the heart resisted it. He found himself thinking less about the moment everything broke and more about what had been built before it did. Not the public image, not the headlines, but the invisible legacy left behind by years of effort, fear, love, and compromise. His father's work resurfaced in unexpected ways. Watching old films felt different now, as if the stories carried messages meant for someone else until suddenly they did not. Themes of loyalty, friendship, and redemption no longer felt aspirational. They felt unfinished. Rob Reiner had spent his life crafting narratives where people faced darkness and found light on the other side. In retrospect, Jake realized how deeply his father believed in those endings, perhaps because he needed them to be true. Art became a form of hope, a way to imagine outcomes that reality refused to provide. What remained was a complicated inheritance. Not fame, not recognition, but questions. How much responsibility does love carry? Where does compassion end and protection begin? When does patience turn into denial? These were not philosophical exercises for Jake. They were the framework of his childhood and the aftermath of his loss. He understood now that legacy is not only what is celebrated, but what is left unresolved. The idea of sacrifice took on a different meaning. His parents had given everything they had emotionally, believing that devotion could shield their family from collapse. In doing so, they sacrificed parts of themselves, their peace, their sense of safety. Jake saw that clearly now, not as judgment, but as truth. Love had guided their decisions, but fear had shaped them. And fear, when left unexamined, can quietly rewrite the rules of a family until no one remembers how they changed. Jake's own life reflected that pattern. He had built a reputation on steadiness, reliability, emotional control. These traits served him well professionally, earning trust and respect. But they also came at a cost. He had learned to equate strength with silence, resilience with self-erasure. The tragedy forced him to confront that belief. Surviving did not mean he had been living fully. It meant he had been enduring. As he stepped back into his work, acting took on new weight. Roles felt less like opportunities and more like responsibilities. He gravitated toward characters shaped by internal conflict, by restraint, by unspoken grief. Audiences responded not because the performances were loud or dramatic, but because they felt honest. Jake understood something now that he had not before. People recognize truth when it is offered without explanation. Journalism, too, shifted in meaning. Reporting was no longer just about delivering facts. It was about understanding the human cost beneath them. Jake found himself listening differently, allowing silence to exist rather than rushing to fill it. He recognized pain in others more quickly, not because he wanted to, but because he could not unsee it. His voice, once controlled to maintain distance, now carried quiet gravity. The idea of healing became less defined. There was no moment of closure, no lesson neatly learned. Instead, there was coexistence. Grief lived alongside progress. Memory existed beside ambition. Jake began to accept that legacy does not demand resolution. It demands acknowledgement. His parents' lives were not defined solely by how they died, just as his brother was not defined solely by what he was accused of. Reality resisted simplicity. In private moments, Jake returned to writing, not to document facts, but to explore meaning. He wrote about fear disguised as love, about families shaped by what they refused to confront, about the danger of believing that endurance alone is enough. These reflections were not meant for an audience. They were meant to help him articulate a truth he had spent decades avoiding, that speaking, even when imperfect, matters. The tragedy reshaped his understanding of responsibility. He no longer believed that protecting others required self-sacrifice without limit. He began to see boundaries not as rejection, but as care. This realization did not bring peace, but it offered direction. A way forward that honored what had been lost without repeating the same patterns. What remained most strongly was the sense that legacy is fragile. Not because it can be destroyed, but because it can be misunderstood. Rob Reiner would be remembered for the stories he told, for the warmth he brought into the world. But within his own family, the legacy was quieter, more complicated, marked by effort and vulnerability. Jake carried that legacy now, not as a burden, but as a reminder. He could not change what had happened. He could not rewrite the past, but he could decide how much silence he would carry into the future. And in that decision, there was something that resembled hope. Not the hopeful belief that everything would be fixed, but the quieter hope that truth, once faced, might prevent another family from breaking the same way. In the end, what remained was not a clean conclusion, but a quiet reckoning. For Jake Reiner, life did not return to normal because normal no longer existed. Days moved forward, schedules filled, work resumed, yet something fundamental had shifted beneath everything. The world expected recovery to look like strength, composure, and productivity. But grief does not follow expectation. It lingers in the background, shaping how every moment is felt, how every decision is weighed. Jake understood that telling his story was never about attention or sympathy. It was about refusing to let silence finish what tragedy had started. When he spoke publicly, when his voice cracked on live television, he exposed something people rarely see. Not celebrity pain, but human vulnerability. That exposure unsettled viewers because it felt too real, too close to home. It forced an uncomfortable recognition that the deepest wounds are often hidden behind patience, love, and good intentions. As the public conversation slowly faded, Jake remained with the truth that some losses cannot be repaired, only carried. He learned that survival is not the same as healing, and that moving forward does not mean leaving anything behind. His parents were present in everything he did, not as ghosts, but as influence, in the way he paused before speaking, in the way he listened longer than necessary, in the way he approached relationships with caution rather than certainty. The name Rob Reiner would always be associated with warmth, humor, and stories that brought people together. The world would continue to celebrate those films, to quote lines that once made them feel understood. Jake did not resent that. He recognized that public legacy and private reality can coexist without canceling each other out. His father's work mattered. It still does. But within the family, the legacy was quieter, shaped by effort rather than outcome, by love that struggled against fear. Jake's understanding of family changed permanently. He no longer believed that love alone could prevent harm, or that patience should replace boundaries. He saw clearly now how easily devotion can turn into denial, how fear can masquerade as care. These realizations were not accusations. They were acknowledgments, born from loss rather than judgment. They did not offer comfort, but they offered clarity. In moments of solitude, Jake often returned to a simple question: what does it mean to protect the people you love? For most of his life, he believed protection meant absorbing pain, staying quiet, and keeping the peace at any cost. The tragedy taught him that protection sometimes means speaking when it feels impossible, drawing lines when it feels cruel, and accepting that you cannot save everyone. That truth did not free him from guilt, but it reshaped how he carried it. As he continued working, audiences noticed a difference, even if they could not name it. His performances felt heavier, more grounded. His presence felt less performative and more deliberate. He was no longer trying to disappear behind a role or a profession. He was allowing himself to be seen, imperfect and unfinished. That shift did not erase grief, but it made space for honesty. Jake never claimed to have answers. He did not offer a moral, a lesson neatly wrapped in resolution. Instead, he left people with questions. Questions about how families communicate, about when intervention becomes necessary, about how easily silence can be mistaken for strength. These questions lingered long after the story ended, because they belonged not just to him, but to anyone who had ever sensed something was wrong and hesitated to speak. The tragedy became more than a single event. It became a warning, not shouted, but whispered through experience. A reminder that love must be paired with clarity, that fear should be acknowledged rather than obeyed, that waiting for things to improve can sometimes allow them to collapse. Jake did not share his pain to reopen wounds. He shared it to prevent others from ignoring the signs he could no longer unsee. As viewers, listeners, and readers absorbed his story, many felt compelled to look inward, to call a parent, to check on a sibling, to reconsider a silence they had justified for too long. That response mattered more than any headline. It meant the pain had not existed in isolation. It had traveled outward, creating connection rather than spectacle. There is no final scene where everything settles. No moment where grief fades into memory. What exists instead is continuation. A life shaped by loss, guided by awareness, and driven by the determination not to repeat what has already been endured. Jake continues forward carrying what remains, not because he has healed, but because he has chosen honesty over avoidance. And if this story leaves you unsettled, if it reminds you of something unresolved in your own life, that discomfort is not accidental. It is the quiet space where change begins. If you have thoughts, reflections, or experiences that this journey stirred within you, share them. Stories like this do not end when the screen goes dark. They continue in the conversations we choose to have next.